Okay. So hi everyone. I am Olatz Román, and I am a PhD candidate at the European University Institute. And I am going on the market this year. However, I wanted to let you know that this is not going to be my job market paper. I think that in this seminar series, we have been seeing very complete job market papers. So I wanted to set the expectations right. This is a little bit greener than what we're used to seeing. But this is this research agenda that I'm very excited about, that I have more recently started. So yeah, let me get started talking about it. So the title that I decided to give it by now is The Geography of Jobs and Couple Migration. So let me start motivating it with something that maybe you are familiar with, which are the cross-county migration rates in the United States. So this is from the current population survey. We have data from the beginning of the 60s until nowadays on couple migration rates and single migration rates. But since the focus of this paper are married couples, that is what I want you to focus on right now. So as you can see, since the beginning of the 60s, couple migration has been steadily decreasing until the beginning of the 2010s, more or less. So it more than halved over this period of time, which is quite a sizable decrease, if you ask me. So what I wanted to point out is that this decrease in couple migration rates does not come from the fact that there have been demographic changes over the same period of time. So what am I plotting here? Here I am running a regression on the probability of migration and including a set of demographic controls like age, sex, education, family income, etc. And then I am plotting the residual at each year to show that couple migration rates, even conditional on these demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, has been decreasing over that time. So what has been going on over this time that can explain the decrease in couple migration? During this period of time, two large changes occurred in the labor market. The first one is that the share of women in the labor force greatly increased over that time. This means that we have a larger share of dual earner households where both partners are working. And from the literature, we know that these type of couples have larger difficulties to migrate in comparison to single earner couples, because now they have to coordinate into the same location in order to be able to move. So when there is a moving opportunity for one of the two partners, now they have to try to find the job for the other partner in order to move locations. And of course, whether they find a job in the new location for the other partner is going to depend on where both partners can work, whether they can coordinate in the same location to work. But not only that, women have not only increased their participation in the labor force, they have also increasingly chosen occupations that are more like those that men were choosing. So that is to say that occupational gender segregation has been decreasing over time. There are still some differences in how women and men choose their jobs. We know from the literature that women often prioritize non-pecuniary job characteristics, such as shorter commuting times, etc., that are related to the geography of jobs as well. But given that this occupational gender segregation has decreased over time, and also that assortative mating has become increasingly common, there has been a substantial change in this period of time. So let me tell you what I am after, giving you an example. So let us think of the traditional couple or the average couple at different periods of time. So let me introduce these two people to you. These are going to be Mark and Anne. And Mark and Anne are the average couple in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, most of the couples were single earner households, where the husband was working, say Mark is an engineer, and the wife is often a housewife. So she is not restricted by her occupation. So let's say that that the husband, Mark, gets a job offer for which they have to move locations. Given that Anne does not have this restriction to find an occupation in the new location, they're relatively free to move to a new location. Let us move forward 20 years to the 1980s, where the average couple looks a little bit different. Now, women have entered the labor force. However, the type of occupations that they choose are still a bit different from those of men. So we still have Mark, who's still an engineer, and we have Anne, who now is working, but she is a teacher, which would be the average occupation of a woman in that period of time. So what happens now? If Mark gets an offer to work somewhere else, Now Anne has to look for a job in that new location, which is a constraint for the mobility probabilities of a couple. However, if we think about teachers, there are teachers essentially everywhere, so the relative ease with which a teacher can find a job in a new location is quite large. And then finally, let's move forward 20 more years and look at the 2000s, where women now have adapted the type of jobs that they have, and they are looking more like those of men. So Mark is still an engineer in year 2000, but Anne is not only working, but she is also an immobile wife, in the sense that she's a biologist, which is a kind of job that is not everywhere. So if we compare biologists with teachers, there are fewer locations where they can potentially do their jobs. So if Mark gets an offer to work somewhere else, the couple is going to be more restricted on whether they can move or not, because it's going to be trickier to find the job for him. So what is it that I'm after? In this paper, I want to study how the geography of occupations is going to be affecting couple migration. So what do I do to answer this question? The first thing is I'm going to propose 2 measures that are trying to capture the joint geographic constraints of couples. The first measure is related to where an occupation can be done, and I'm going to be referring to it as the geographic concentration of an occupation. And the other measure is going to be related to what are the set of locations where the 2 individuals in a couple with a given pair of occupations can find a job together. And I'm going to propose 2 measures for this, and I find that these 2 measures are quite stable over the period of time that I just showed you. So having these 2 measures at hand, I'm going to be studying the association between the geography of an occupation, referring to these 2 measures, and migration decisions of couples. And a priori, this may not be super straightforward, how both concentration and overlap are going to be affecting couple migration. There could be some push factors that are making more concentrated occupations more profitable to move for. But on the other hand, there are going to be some very clear break factors where if my partner is in a more geographically constrained occupation, this is also going to constrain the set of locations where we can jointly move to. Here, I find that actually couples where both partners are in high concentrated occupations migrate less, but this is mitigated by a higher overlap in the set of locations where they can jointly do their jobs. And then finally, if I get to that, I'm studying the gender differences in occupational choices over this period of time. So namely, I want to see whether women and men chose different occupations based on how geographically concentrated they were, and whether this has been changing over time, with the consequences that that is going to have on the types of couples that are formed. And I'm going to try to see whether the decrease in migration rates that I showed you before can be explained by these changes in the types of couples that there are. And what I find here is that women are increasingly more in concentrated occupations, which is changing the set of couples that are formed. So very briefly, let me mention how I'm trying to contribute to the literature here. First, I'm contributing to the literature on migration decisions of couples. So there is this established fact that women tend to be tied migrants much more often than men are, and this induces losses for them in the labor force, increasing the gender wage gap. What I am proposing here is an explanation for why are women more often tied migrants, which is an explanation that is attached to their occupations, that their occupations require less migration than men's do. And the other one is trying to explain who migrates through the joint geographic constraints of couples. Second, I aim to contribute to the literature on occupational segregation by gender. So I'm documenting some sorting based on the geographic availability of jobs for men and women and how this has evolved over time. And then finally, I'm contributing to these explanations on the decline in internal migration in the United States. Several explanations have been proposed, but fewer have been done from the perspective of the couple. And I am connecting this with a very relevant structural change in the labor force over the studied period of time. So I don't know if there are any questions at this stage. Otherwise, I'm going to continue and just start telling you about the measures. Okay. So before I do that, let me tell you which data I am using to construct the measures. I'm using the decennial census in the United States, and I will be using the largest available microdata samples, which are the 1% or 5% of the population, starting in 1970 until the last census, which was, not the last census actually, until 2010. And something that is important that I mentioned is that the geographic level that is provided by the decennial census are counties with more than 100K inhabitants. So using this data, I have to define two things. The first one, how I define occupations. I will be using the Otter-Dorn classification of occupations, which is based on the 1990 census. And this provides the balanced panel of 330 occupations for all the census years. And second, defining the geographic unit, I'm also going to be using the crosswalks provided by Otter and Dorn, which are based on the 1990 commuting zones and are built based on those counties from before. And this is going to be giving 741 commuting zones. Okay, so let me start by showing you what I was referring to before with the location of occupations. So here what I'm plotting is the share of workers in a commuting zone out of the US total. So let's say out of all the teachers in the United States, what is the share that is located in each one of these commuting zones? So here you can see that the distribution of teachers is relatively equal over the entire United States. Places that are less populated have fewer teachers, but let's say that in general, we have teachers everywhere, which is the example that I was giving before. But what happens if we look at a different occupation, like is the case of astronomers and physicists? Now the picture looks very, very different. We have a lot of yellow, meaning that we have a lot of zeros. Nobody is employed as an astronomer or a physicist in these areas. And employment as astronomers or physicists is located more in denser urban areas or areas with universities. So this is precisely what I'm trying to capture with the measure of geographic concentration of occupations. So I'm taking the measure from this paper by Alan Benson in 2014, which is a generalized version of Duncan's dissimilarity index. So I'm writing here the formula for you to know, but let me just intuitively tell you that this first component here is what I was plotting in the maps before. So it's out of total employment in an occupation, what is the share in the different locations? And this second element here is making it relative to the distribution of employment in the other occupations and in the other locations. This is still not very clear, so let me explain how we interpret this index. So this would be to say, what is the share of workers that would have to relocate in order to balance employment in a given occupation across all locations. So say 5% of the US labor force are primary school teachers. What is the share of primary school teachers that would have to relocate across commuting zones such that 5% of the labor force in each commuting zone are teachers? So just to balance it out across all locations. So a higher value of the DDI, that is how I will be referring to this geographic concentration measure. Higher values are going to be indicating more concentration, that is, that the job is available in a smaller set of locations. And then what I do is I follow Benson and I normalize it by taking the log and making all the values of it positive. So let me show you what the measure looks like. So here on the left panel, I'm showing you the distribution of the DDI in 2 different years, in 1970, the first year in the sample, and 2010. So you see a little bit the distribution. You can see that over this period of time, it looks like the average values shifted a little bit to higher values of the DDI, meaning that they shifted to higher values of the concentration of the measure. Here on the other panel, I'm looking a bit more directly at how the average DDI evolved over this period of time. So here I am plotting the concentration measure computed separately by each one of the sensors. And as you can see, the measure is relatively stable over this period of time. There's only a slight increase in year 2010, which coincides with the Great Recession. So maybe something was going on there. But in general, what I get out of this is that concentration seems to have been quite stable over this period of time. And then the second thing that I want to mention here is that when I compute the mean weighted by the size of an occupation, the average goes much below, meaning that those occupations that are more concentrated are also employing fewer individuals. So once we have the first measure, the measure of where are occupations, let's look at what is the other measure, which is trying to answer the question of, can two occupations be done in the same set of locations? And again, this is going to be based in the maps that I was showing you before. So how do I construct this measure? First, I take practically the vectors that I was plotting in the maps before in a vector form. So for each occupation J, I take a vector of the share of its total employment in each commuting zone. So I just have a vector per occupation where each one of the cells belongs to a different commuting zone. So having one vector per occupation, then I compute the correlation of this vector of these vectors for any two occupations. So I'm going to have a value for each pair of occupations for this overlap measure. So it being a measure of correlation, it's going to be distributed between -1 and 1, meaning that and values closer to 0 are going to be those, meaning that there's lower correlation between the locations of two different occupations. So let us consider two examples so you understand what I mean. So first, consider two occupations such as lawyers and paralegals. Even though they're different occupations, the set of locations where they're going to be located are probably going to be very, very similar. But considering a different couple or different pair of occupations, such as financial managers, who are potentially going to be located more often in larger urban areas, or conservation scientists, who are going to be located in either university areas or national parks, doing more natural work, then we can see that the overlap is much lower in between those two occupations than between lawyers and paralegals. So I hope that this clarifies a little bit what overlap is trying to capture. So let me show you very quickly how this is related to the measures of concentration. So the y and the x-axis of this plot are the concentration measures of two different occupations, and then the different colors indicate different values of overlap. And I know this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive because lighter colors mean higher values of the overlap measure and darker colors mean lower values of the overlap measure. So here you can see that there are very, very few negative values, only for very, very concentrated occupations, and that for occupations that are not very concentrated, the overlap measure is practically 1. So there is a high degree of overlap when the occupation can be done everywhere, and when the occupation is very restricted in the set of locations where it can be done, then the overlap with other occupations goes down greatly. So I don't know if there are any questions on the two measures. Those are the two measures that I'm going to be studying right now. So if you have anything now or later, feel free to ask. So let me move on to the study of how these joint geographic constraints, as measured by the concentration measure and the overlap measure, are associated to migration decisions. For the migration data, I mentioned that I will be using the current population survey, and I would like to point out the two elements of the data that I am mostly using, which are occupations and migration information. So I have information on the occupation for an individual this year and 1 year ago. And I also know what is their migration status. I know whether they migrated in the last 12 months. either across counties, across states, or abroad. So that is information that I will be using. As I was mentioning before, a priori, it does not seem so straightforward how concentration and overlap are going to be affecting migration decisions in general, and more specifically, couple migration decisions. So there could be some push factors that are making migration more appealing for high concentrated occupations. So let's say if higher concentrated occupations had higher gains from migration, then even if my partner is in a high concentrated occupation, maybe both of us have more incentives to migrate because opportunities to migrate come for me and my partner as well. But the cleanest way of looking at these push factors, at whether the gains from migration are larger for high concentrated occupations, is by looking at single individuals, and that is what I'm doing here. And unless you want me to go into detail at what I'm doing at each point, I'm just going to walk you through what I find. So I find that single individuals in high concentrated occupations are more likely to migrate for a job, conditional on having migrated. After moving, they're also less likely to become unemployed. And they're less likely to change occupations after a move if they were carrying out a college occupation, so an occupation where college was required. However, the opposite is the case for high concentrated occupations that did not require migration. And this is a difference between, well, within the group of high concentrated occupations, the ones that require college education are mostly related to very specific, very specialized occupations, like astronomers, physicists, financial managers that are required in very few locations. Then the ones that do not require college are more related to extraction. So miners, etc., are in these high concentrated occupations. So if they were to move to a different location, if there is not a mining place there, then it's more difficult to do their job there. And then the final piece that we would need to be able to say yes, higher concentration occupations are enticing migration, would be some evidence on labor earnings. However, this evidence is much weaker. There is a positive coefficient there, but it's not very substantial. On the other hand, we have some what I call break factors. So this is purely related to the couple, and it's not going to take a role for single migration decisions. So the break factors are to say that these joint geographic restrictions, if my partner is in a high concentrated occupation, they're going to intensify the co-location problem by restricting the set of locations where we can jointly move to. So the set of evidence that I found in this direction is a little bit more complicated, because here I can only look at couple migration decisions, not clean it by looking only at singles, is that partner concentration makes migrating for a job less likely. Occupation changes and unemployment after migration become likelier in couples where partners are in concentrated occupations. But it is important to mention that a higher overlap between the set of locations where both partners can do their occupations mitigates these negative impacts. So it's not going in this break direction, but it looks like overlap mitigates all the negative impacts that being in a high concentration couple may have. But let's look directly at how concentration is affecting migration decisions. So how I do this is by looking at different types of couples based on the concentration of their occupations. So taking the concentration levels as computed in year 1990, I define high concentration occupations, like the top third of occupations with highest concentration levels, and the bottom 2/3 are going to be low concentrated occupations. And using this classification, I'm going to divide couples into 5 different types. First, we have single earner couples, where only one of the 2 partners is participating in the labor force. So I would argue that these types of couples are the ones that are going to migrate most, because they do not have this co-location problem of having to find a job for the other partner. Then within dual earner couples, where we have that both partners are participating in the labor force, we're going to divide them based on the degree of concentration that their occupations have. So we have couples where both are in low concentrated occupations, which will have, if we believe these push factors before, are going to have lower incentives to migrate, but they will have the flexibility to migrate if they wanted to. Then we have mixed couples where one of the partners is in a low concentrated occupation and the other in a high concentrated occupation. So in these kind of couples, they can arguably respond to the migration needs of the high because it's relatively easier for the low concentrated partner to be able to find a job in a new location. Then we have couples where both are in a high concentrated occupation and they have different occupations. For these people, it's going to be the most difficult to migrate because it's very difficult to coordinate in a set of locations that works for both. And then finally, we have couples where they're both in high concentrated occupations, but they are in the same occupation. And these two may benefit from either joint offers or simply the fact that if we're moving to a location where there's a lot of jobs in our occupation, it's very likely that the both of us will find a job. So how I study this is just by taking single earner households as a baseline and running a regression on whether on the type of the couple the period before. So I add a dummy for low, mixed, high, and same occupation couples, and looking at the outcome of whether they migrate or not. And then a control for a set of socioeconomic characteristics. As you can see here, everybody, all types of couples, migrate at lower rates than single earner couples, which is what I was hypothesizing before. But they do so at different rates. I think that the most salient thing here is that those in high concentration couples with different occupations are the ones that migrate the least. But I guess that the important thing to show here is whether these different types of couples migrate at different rates from each other. So based on these estimates, I carry out the pairwise comparisons across all couple types. And then looking at this, I confirm that single earner couples migrate significantly more than any type of dual earner couples. That high concentration couples are the ones that migrate the least, so less than any other type of couple. And that the rest are not statistically different from each other in terms of their migration rates. But we see that high concentration is really dampening the migration rates of couples. But what happens? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, hi. Sorry, you can finish your sentence and then I'll ask my question.
No, I was going to go to the next slide. So.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering if there's any selection story into these 4 couple types. Like, do you think, based on the literature on assortative mating, that perhaps certain couple or certain individuals select their partners based on their ability to move or not move? So if I were a licensed doctor in Texas, I can't move outside of Texas because it'll be hard for me to maintain my license. So maybe I'm only looking for partners who similarly can only work in Texas, for instance.
Yeah, no, that could definitely play part in the story of the story. So right now, what I'm trying to think about is conditional on the couple and conditional on the occupations that they have. What are the patterns that we observe based on these things? But definitely what you're mentioning is going to play a very important role. And it is something that I would like to exploit in the future, looking at, as I was mentioning before, whether there is a assortative mating in this aspect, if people make occupational decisions based on their, let's say, their marriage market perspectives based on this or that. So the example that you're putting is super valid. Something else that you could think about is that if I really want to marry and I want to be married to a very successful man, then maybe I will just choose an occupation that can take me anywhere, rather than just being restricted by my occupation. I'm going to be restricted by somebody else's occupation. So yeah, it's a very valid point, very important, but I am not addressing it at this point. Okay. So yeah, after looking at concentration, let's see at what overlap has to say in this whole story. So opposite to concentration, overlap actually facilitates migration for couples. So if we both can do our occupation in a more similar set of locations, then it's going to be more likely that we actually migrate. And the effect is going to be heterogeneous for the different types of couples, but it's most important for those couples where both of them are employed in high concentration occupations. So I think I'm good with that. So I think I can continue and talk to you a little bit about these gender differences in occupational choices based on the geographic concentration of occupations, and very briefly maybe mention what I am thinking about doing in order to try to explain those decreasing migration rates that I was motivating the presentation with. So the first thing that I look at is whether traditionally, so at the beginning of the observation period, men and women were selecting themselves into different occupations based on the concentration of those occupations. So here on the first panel, I'm showing what is the share of women in an occupation in 1970 for the level of concentration in that same year. And we can see that there's a negative slope here, meaning that occupations where there are more women employed tend to be less concentrated. Here, there's a lot of dispersion for occupations where there are no men employed. But those that are the highest concentrated are the ones that are employing pretty much no women. So looking at maintaining the share of women in 1970 here, so this ordering, the vertical ordering is going to be the same. What happens in year 2010? So I just want to see whether the level of concentration of this occupation changed over time based on the share of women in this period of time. We see that this didn't change so much. The slope is still negative, meaning that those occupations that were predominantly male at the beginning of the observation period are still the most highly concentrated, and those where women were predominating became a bit more concentrated. And then, just in case you're interested, here are the examples that I was giving before. So we have primary school teachers with a lot of women employed and very low levels of concentration, both in 1970 and in 2010. And we have astronomers and physicists with a very large share of men employed and also really large levels of concentration. And here are economists, which still have more men than women, but we're working on that. So after seeing this, then the next question to ask is whether women increasingly select into occupations that are more concentrated or not. So I was mentioning there's a lot of evidence that women are choosing occupations that are more like those of men over this period of time. Now the question is, are they also selecting into those male-dominated occupations that are more concentrated in space or not? And the evidence here, so sorry, let me explain what I do for this plot. First, I am taking the concentration measure as computed in year 1990, and I am plugging it in the CPS data. So for each individual, I am assigning a level of concentration to their occupation, and then I'm computing the average concentration for men and for women separately at each CPS year. So I'm essentially maintaining the level of concentration, the concentration measure, constant over time, and only looking at the changes in the composition of occupations for men and women over this period of time. We can see that concentration for men slightly decreased and then stayed relatively stable over time, but for women, this has been steadily increasing. But I would like to show you something that I found quite interesting, which is what happens if we divide them by education. And here we find that the average concentration of college-educated men stayed quite constant, and for non-college educated women, it also stayed quite constant, but there was a large increase in the degree of concentration for college-educated women over this period of time. So it looks like the increase in concentration in women's occupations comes purely from women who are getting college education. So with these two pieces of evidence, the next thing that I want to do is look at whether these patterns can explain the decreasing migration rate that I was mentioning before.
Olatz, you
yes.
have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so this is very like a preliminary approach to this. I will tell you in a second what I'm trying to do, but I'm essentially doing a shift share decomposition, just an accounting exercise to try to decompose the change in the migration rate since year 1970 until year 2010, and see where this is coming from. Essentially, if it's coming from changes in how the different types of couples are migrating over this period of time, or changes in the shares of each types of couples over that period of time. Types of couples being the ones that I was defining before, either single earner couples, low concentration, etc. So what I am finding so far doing this exercise is that what matters is this within component. The different types of couples have actually changed the way in which they are migrating over this time, rather than the composition of the couples being what is determining this migration. But because I don't have much time, let me very briefly conclude already with what we have learned so far. So I propose these two measures of geographic concentration of overlap of occupations. And we see that they have remained relatively stable over this period of time. We see that these joint geographic constraints, so concentration and overlaps, can explain the migration patterns of couples. And then there's some evidence that women and men have traditionally sorted into different occupations based on their geographic concentration, but that women have increasingly chosen more concentrated occupations by choosing more men-like occupations. So now let me tell you where I'm trying to get to with this. First, I would like to have given that this paper so far has been very, very descriptive of these two measures, I would like to more empirically try to causally show that concentration or shocks to concentration impact couple migration, which I would like to do by studying shocks to concentration through the staggered introduction of state-level occupational licensing requirements, with some new data that is coming out very soon. But then theoretically, I would like to do this last exercise that I was showing you in a cleaner way by developing a model of endogenous location choices with different occupations based on where they are available. And yeah, I would say that that is everything from my side. If you have any questions or comments, I'm very happy to hear.
Thank you very much, Olatz. Well, before opening the floor for discussion, we are going to have the short discussion by Isabella.
Yes, let me 1 second. Let me share my screen. Does this work? And
Yes, we can see it.
And now it's in full screen. Or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me to discuss Olatz's paper. So I generally thought, so I really like the paper. I think it's a great, it also has great potential. And yeah, I didn't know about this staggered implementation that you were just discussing earlier. And I think that sounds really, really cool. So per instructions, have skipped the summary of the paper, and I'm just going directly into kind of what I thought was the sort of what were the strengths of the paper. So firstly, it definitely focuses on it has a relevant focus group. So majority of households in the US are dual income at this point. And this has very clear implications for studying labor mobility. This also has, down the line, some potential to explain gender wage gaps or trends in gender wage gaps. Also, for the discussion of the two proposed measures, I thought it was very detailed in the paper. Also, Olatz did a very good job in the presentation. so there were many examples to kind of help understand these different indices and clear figures. So overall, the discussion of the measures is very, very detailed and easy to understand. So yeah, let me kind of now move on to kind of what I thought about the paper as I was reading it. So the paper has two measures. So the arguably kind of more novel part of the paper is this geographic overlap measure. And this geographic measure, since it's a correlation, it's symmetric for both partners. And I actually thought that the symmetry is very attractive if you want to think about separating yourself from your gender. It's desirable if you want to capture the potential or difficulty of moving. Yeah, so this is treating your own occupation, and the distribution of occupations across space is given. So I think that the symmetry of the measure is a very attractive feature of the paper. That is to say, like currently most of the analysis in the paper is done using the other measure. So maybe at some point, given that this is like the more novel part in terms of the measurement, you want to include also more kind of analysis using the geographic overlap measure as well. Then also for the, let me just like move the, okay, yeah. For the measurement of occupations across space, one thing that came to my mind is that there is some degree of occupational mobility post-moving, meaning that I think so. Yeah, in the presentation, you mentioned the interaction between that people with college degree are less likely to change their occupations, but the kind of baseline is that people are actually more likely to change occupations over time. And then I thought about this changing of the occupation, in that so occupations which might have very different kind of DDI might also at the same time require similar skills. So we can think about, for example, electricians versus wind turbine technicians. So in principle, they can kind of perform similar jobs. And so that made me think about like how important is the DDI of the next closest job of your partner in our moving decision. So essentially, perhaps there's a way to add to the paper, because I think it could be potentially very cool to add this degree of kind of skill transferability. So the idea being that, it's not only my occupation that matters in this instant, because I could also change it to something similar, right? But not all occupations can be changed that easily to something else, right? So this was basically my idea. I do think that with ONET for the US, this could be somehow implemented empirically as well, since they, from what I understand, give you kind of similar occupations based on skills. So yeah, this could be a potential addition to make the DDI measure also kind of more to add on the Benson DDI measure. Yes, so then I mentioned that I quite liked the fact that the overlap measure was symmetric, and the DI measure is also symmetric. But when I started looking at the results, I thought that perhaps what we would expect is kind of gender asymmetry in individual migration decisions that's right now not quite captured. So for example, this in the first table, so this is the individual kind of single, the analysis of the single men and women. And so I think it would be quite interesting to see, on the one hand, the gender dummy, which right now is a control, but it's not included in the table, but also kind of the interaction of gender and this distribution, because like I could very well imagine that it takes kind of a stronger change in the DDI for women in order for them to have the same probability, to reach the same probability of migration as men. So perhaps gender doesn't only influence the level, but it also influences the slope. Yeah. So this was sort of my idea. And relatedly, so I'm not like sure about this, but it seemed to me like in this part of the paper, the dummy for migrating for a job, like the zero, the reference category, so to say, is migrating but not for work. And so since women are kind of less likely to move anyway, this makes the sample quite selected in that piece. And so perhaps you would consider changing it to kind of not migrating and migrating not for work as the reference category. So I think this would also make it more coherent with the next parts, which I think use the other category. I would make very similar arguments. I will be making very similar arguments from now on. So when it comes to the couple migration, one could split the mix couple type by, for example, who's the high, who's the low, the man or the woman, and then also the single earner man could be perhaps a category, but maybe there are also some single earner, some couples in which the woman is the single earner. So this could be kind of separate category. So you could extend it by having this gender perspective on this. And yeah, again, kind of the same here. So these are almost all my comments. I also thought that the paper could, so minor things like the paper, I think the way, I mean, you think about this in the end. I thought that the way the presentation was structured was very clear, but as I was reading the paper and kind of analyzing, I would like to go back to the data section, but the data, for example, is in different parts. So I think the paper kind of could use some reorganization. Yeah, just generally some kind of more support of statements. So maybe add how large are the correlations in some figures where it's not actually clear how large the correlations are, or perhaps some t-tests for means between different values. So yeah, I will send you these slides later. Yeah, and also, so the final questions you actually answered in your presentation, I think. So you mentioned that it was extraction occupations. Yeah, right. So yeah, that was just more of a like curiosity question. Yeah. Yeah, and so these are my comments. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for the comments. Actually, I think they're all like very good points, and some of the things are actually, they're definitely on the list. First of all, what you were mentioning about the task similarity, that is definitely something that I want to do. I haven't quite figured out yet how I want to do that. I was thinking something about trying to construct some measure of distance of tasks across different occupations, and then kind of incorporating the concentration of the different occupations, using these kind of distances across the different occupations to the one that I am currently in. But yeah, I need to figure out something there, because it is definitely true, right? It's different to move. Sorry, it's different to have an occupation that is super specific, or having some more general skills that I could use in other occupations. So it would not be such a big deal to move for my partner's occupation if I can do something very related to what I'm currently doing. Then what you were mentioning about the gender component, I have to admit that this was a bit of stubbornness, not having done it so far, or not having shown it. Well, because I did look at it at some point, and I have to admit I don't quite remember what I was getting there, but I imagine not something very different, or I would have included it in the paper. I guess that the main point that I wanted to make is that maybe it is not that we are biased and that is why we want to migrate for the man, but it's simply the occupations that we have. So I was trying to to support that idea. But in order to support that idea, I definitely have to look at whether there are differences by whether I am the one that is high concentrated or my partner is. And yeah, no, like that is like my explanation for why I always was focusing only on this concentration and overlap measures without really saying, okay, how does this interact with the gender? But yeah, in terms of that, what I looked at so far, it is true that there's a low like shifter for women, in single women in migration, so women migrate less on average. But the slope was not changing very much, and I did do it as well. I did do the analysis, not only looking at conditional on migrating, but for everybody, and I still found the same coefficients, like same direction of coefficients as the ones you showed. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you, Isabella. Now, if any of the participants has any questions, you can raise your hand and I will give you voice, or you can write your question on the chat box and we will read it to Olatz. Right, and we're going to have one question by Daniel. Daniel, you have permission to talk now.
Okay, do you get me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Olatz, for your presentation, and Isabella for the discussion as well. So I just wanted to know if your data allow you to, if your data include cases of one partner migration in couples, and how do you treat these cases in your analysis? And the other point, maybe it's a suggestion, maybe a kind of supplementary analysis. I was thinking about analyzing all the form of mobility, especially daily mobility, which may be something that we observe in high concentrated couples, for example, working in other cities and commuting each day. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. So for your first point, the thing is that if the partners are not living together, I do not observe both partners, so they're not included in the sample. So I'm only considering, yeah, I am making the assumption that couples have to move together, but that is a good point, that not necessary. And about the second point, I mean, I am not aware that there's commuting information in the CPS. I think this is a little bit, I mean, it's definitely related, but it's a little bit different from the focus of the paper, which really is related to migration. What I can say about that is that, well, there's some previous evidence about preferences for longer or shorter commutes, and we know that women tend to have preferences for shorter commutes than men do, and that decisions of where to locate within the city tend to be closer to the woman's workplace rather than closer to the husband's workplace. But yeah, that is not something that I have been looking at so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you too.
You can go, Mitali.
Okay, I was waiting to see if there's anyone else. I don't know if this is possible, but I think it would also be interesting, or I'm not sure if you have any like thoughts about welfare implications of migration. So you had said, like, I think you had shown us earlier for single earning households that moving and migrating had like a weak positive effect on labor earnings, perhaps. So I was wondering if maybe, because if the story is that couples that don't migrate, like maybe one of the partners would be making more money had they migrated, but they're foregoing that opportunity because then they wouldn't be dual income anymore, for instance. And if they hadn't migrated, both partners would have an opportunity to work and earn. So I was wondering if there's a way to maybe compare people who migrated and one partner lost their job or had to change occupations to cases where they weren't migrating, just to see if there were any welfare implications. Because my larger thought is just Is it so bad that people in high concentrated areas aren't migrating? Maybe they're in cities and earning as much as they can. So I think it'd be interesting if you had any thoughts on what the welfare implications of your work might be.
Yeah, no, definitely. That is something that that I could look at least. My hunch would be that at least if they migrate and one of the two people has to forego their jobs, or initially there's going to be a loss in earnings. I cannot say so much about welfare. I don't know how to measure that like right now in the data, but definitely that is something that would be very interesting to look at in the context of the model. So if I manage to build that model finally, to make that kind of comparisons in a much clearer way. So up to what point of whether individuals in different couples are willing to forego larger or lesser amounts of income in different locations in order to migrate or to not migrate. But yeah, that is not something that I can give an answer to right now, but I think that is really interesting and something that I need to.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to ask mine then. I was wondering about the geographic overlap measure that you calculate, because I think that you calculated only for a moment in time, right?
No, I calculated for the different
For the different census?
Yes.
Okay. No, because I was going to say, yeah, maybe the overlap of occupations changes over time. So
yeah,
okay,
no,
cool.
it stays quite stable over time. And then I also looked at whether different cohorts are in differently overlapped couples, and everything seems to be relatively stable over time. Yeah, I stress this on the concentration measure, but not so much on the overlap measure. But yeah.